I just put the book down at several stages because I was quite blown away by it.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of The Lit Path, a podcast about novels that have changed men's lives. My next guest is Ioan Marc Jones, a writer whose work has appeared in pretty much any British publication you can think of, from The Guardian to The Times to The FT, and we're going to be speaking today about the novel that has meant the most to him over the years. It's a pleasure to introduce you, Ioan. Thank you very much for joining me here. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I've just described you there in pretty broad terms, but perhaps you can give us a better understanding of what you do and what brings you into the studio today.
Yeah, so I think I'm a freelance writer, as you mentioned, and that's broadly what I cover books. I try to cover books as much as possible. There probably isn't as much outlet for it, but I've kind of just transitioned into freelance writing full time, whereas I did it sort of briefly before. And yeah, I wrote an article in The Guardian recently. I think that's how we connected, and it was about the new trying to read 100 of the best novels of all time and returning to classics. So like I have this quite an interesting history of reading. It's got so many weird drives and like pushed by my parents when I was young, and all the way to like this novel kind of changing my life in different ways. I've had like every part of my life has been swept by some different text. I remember them all. And I think it's just that's kind of what led us here. I'm basically a huge reader. I think that's kind of why I'm here. And hopefully I can give some insight into men and reading, I think.
Before we speak about the novel that you've chosen to talk to me about today, let's go right back to the beginning with you. Where did you grow up, and how did your development as a reader really start?
Yeah, my parents are both Welsh, and they moved to London when I was before I was born. I was born in Ealing Broadway, which is actually not too far from where we are now. I actually lived around the corner from here for a brief period, and yeah, they were both working class people who kind of literature started from birth with me because my house was covered in books, and they kind of almost were part of, I mentioned this in the article, the literary working class, these people who vaguely believed that great works were going to, enrich their lives and actually lead to betterment, something that's perhaps lost today. And they fundamentally kind of entrenched that within us. Anytime we said we were bored, anytime we moaned about pretty much anything, both my parents would say, read a book. It was just there. My dad would slam a dictionary but down. It was always, reading was the way that you became better. And I had that from a young age. I mean, I remember being in a curry house in Ealing, and my dad saying that he believed there was, apart from public service, there was pretty much one good job. And I was like, what's that? I'm like 7 at the time, and he was like a writer. And I remember going, oh, like they were so important in our house. I remember being 8 years old and trying to read War and Peace because I was so desperate to basically get my dad's validation, because he said this is the hardest book. My parents used to hide their finances in that book. Like back in the day, it was like a checkbook, and so they used to hide it, and they hid it there because it was the hardest and longest book. And so I remember grabbing it, being 8 years old, and going. I remember sitting by a swimming pool while my brother swam, and me and my 2 brothers with my mum. And I was reading War and Peace at 8 years old. I read about 3 pages, and then I was like, okay, I obviously can't read this.
Mm-hmm.
But it was that was the life that I led, the reading life that I led, where books were paramount. In school, it was opposite, because once I went to secondary school, and we might touch on this later, but being an intelligent man, a reading man, was absolutely frowned upon. I went to a local state school where it was quite rough, even though academically it wasn't too bad. But it was frowned upon. Like, I would never have told my friends I was reading at home. I kind of read in secret, even from my brothers. I shared a bedroom with my brothers, and like if I was reading, I would kind of, although for them, because they grew up in my house, it was a little bit more accepted. And a lot of my early reading, I'm kind of giving my history of reading, I hope that's kind of right. A lot of my early reading was actually to kind of seeking validation from my parents, I think, like particularly with my dad, because he was a big reader. And if I wanted his attention, it was quite strange, but I would read and I would talk about books. He loved Orwell, Steinbeck, Solzhenitsyn. It was largely male writers. A lot of my early reading life was male writers, typically because you read the classics and you read these big books. But yeah, I remember being like 15 and reading Solzhenitsyn just still to impress my dad. And then we'd be in the garden talking about books, and I'd be like, well, did you know this about George Orwell or Steinbeck? And he'd be like, moderately impressed. And so I was driven from a young age by that quite strange seeking validation, and it's almost performative reading as we know it now. But I think then slowly I started getting into it in different ways, and then when I went to university, I had that thing where you read Jack Kerouac and you go, "Oh, this is so different." And Bob Dylan has that quote where he's like, "Kerouac changed my life at 17 the way he changed everyone's." And I had that thing too of like liking Kerouac for about 3 years and then going, there's a world out there that goes beyond Jack Kerouac. And then it went into trying to read everything. Maybe it's still driven by like a sense of imposter syndrome. Maybe it's like, I don't know, the state education and thinking, oh, all these people, I was in those circles where my friends at home are sort of lads and they're, not caring too much about all those things. And then I was finding myself as quite an intelligent lad in those circles where suddenly I was trying to impress people. So I tried to read everything. And I think all my life generally has been driven by imposter syndrome, probably less so in the last few years when I've come to kind of build up my self-esteem around reading and then like champion that side of me. But yeah, a lot of it, even up to this book, which was another shift, where that's where I started finding, I mean, I read men right up to 25 almost exclusively. The only women I read would have been the classics. So it was Eliot, it was Woolf, it was Austen, and I read all of the Brontes, and I loved them. But men, because they were the big names that I was trying to show off that I'd read, that I read. It's Nabokov, it's Joyce, it's Beckett, it's Kafka. And those were the people I read because I wanted to be in those situations. And if someone said something, these people I found impressive because they were other than me, I wanted to be able to impress them. So I'd read all these books, and then, with my like accent, I'd kind of, hope to be in those spaces where I didn't really feel like I was maybe welcome. Not welcome, because it was academia, but at the same time, it was just kind of, yeah, trying to feel safe in those spaces. And the way to do that was to be above everyone. So there was quite warped drives.
It's interesting, though, to go back to what you said at the very beginning about how your dad's esteem of writers and of reading informed what you as a young boy aspired to be. It really goes to show, doesn't it, that anything that a boy's father tells him is worthy of praise or is status giving is precisely what that boy will grow up to consider validating.
Yeah.
In a way, a great gift that your dad gave you that sense that reading was the thing, but quite unusual, broadly speaking, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, the other one was rugby. He's Welsh, so the other one was rugby. I mean, my dad took me to rugby when I was young, and then because rugby in this country is largely privately educated, you get a massive boost. So I went when I was in primary school, and then I was as good as anyone else, and then everyone just started getting away from me because I was one of the few state educated people there. So I couldn't kind of compete. So I went to football because everyone loved football, and then my dad just had no interest.
Yeah.
But his validation's really interesting because it was quite withholding. And it's kind of like that. I was constantly and working very hard for that approval. And I think now I've transferred that onto, well, hopefully I'm getting away from it because it seems weird to sort of, I still think it's there though. I mean, and maybe it never leaves you, but it was seeking approval from my peers at that point who in some way, just an accent, like that would seem, it seemed like that maybe they had things that I didn't have growing up. And this isn't to suggest that we were particularly bad off or anything, we were sort of middle class, lower middle class between those areas. But I didn't feel like I had the same access to some of the people I went to uni with. And it was just kind of constantly seeking to feel, I suppose, validated in those spaces.
Well, one of the founding observations of the Lit Path is that, broadly speaking, men gravitate towards nonfiction because there's a sense in which you're grappling with the world as it really is, in inverted commas. Did you find that as you were sort of seeking your father's validation, particularly in the early stages, you were not only trying to achieve the most basic thing, which was to have read, say, War and Peace, The Trial, whatever it might have been, but that also you felt that there was maybe some right answer that you were meant to understand?
Well, it's interesting because I did this thing with Orwell particularly, where I wrote an essay about him years and years ago. I must have been in my early 20s, and it was published in a place called the Essay Review. I think that 15 years later it doesn't exist. But I remember reading it in my early 20s where we would sit and sort of have drinks and my family would talk about literature and politics. Like it would be a normal thing. My friends would come around and go, what is happening here? When you're all kind of like debating radical politics. And it was a lovely thing. It was a privilege to grow up in that household. But equally, I remember reading about Orwell more than reading Orwell. So I would read, all these books about Orwell, essays about Orwell, and try to understand it so that when my dad said, so I had the answer to what the book meant, not to me, but what the book meant to people who knew more than I did. And I guess that speaks to the kind of conundrum you mentioned, in that I'm actually trying to figure out what the book means, not, subjectively. Like, well, so it was quite interesting in that I even read Orwell's essays to learn about Dickens, and because my dad liked Dickens as well, and then I would pit them against each other. And this is when I started maybe like almost detaching from my dad and realizing, because I'd read a lot more than him by this point, and that was kind of my purpose. It's not pretty, and I'm not proud of it, but I did like really want to read everything so that I could kind of be like, look at me, and then it kind of, in retrospect, it wasn't, my proudest moment. But then I would read authors he liked talking about each other, like Dickens and Orwell, and Dickens being the good example, because he wrote that long essay on Dickens' politics. And then I would use that to quote to kind of undermine him. So I don't know, it was almost, it's strange, because while I'm trying to grasp, there was a level of like, maybe it's unnatural to read in that way. And in an ideal world, we'd read going, this is a book and I want to interpret it. I always wonder whether you should, read the introductions of those Oxford World Classics. I mean, in the article for The Guardian, I suggest that will give you a much better understanding of what you're grappling with. But there is an argument to say, don't read that. How do you feel about it? How do you feel devoid of any other interpretation, devoid of what my dad thinks about me or what my peers think about me? How do I feel about the book? And it would be much more sort of complex reading world if we had that. But what I went in a lot of the time, and still today, is to think, okay, I don't want to be wrong about this, which is a little disconcerting, but again, probably quite natural.
I think that what you're describing there is the sense in which when literature is given to you, particularly by somebody as influential as your father, as something to be esteemed, something that distinguishes you if you engage with it from others, something that which gives you a certain virtue, then it leads you onto a path, I think, of seeing reading as not just the right thing to do, but also to understand it correctly as the goal. And also, I think probably what leads a lot of people into academia is the sense in which my enjoyment, my subjective experience of all of these things, not just literature, but any pursuit, is not the point. The point is to have an overarching, grounded understanding of what is going on at a technical level. And as you say, reading about writers' essays and about writers' lives, and in a sense being able to accumulate a lot of facts around them and not just how you felt about their work, is something that I think a lot of people with a genuine passion for literature end up pursuing. In a way, I think the book you've chosen to speak about today is a reminder of what it's like to be immersed in something that hits you very, very much at an individual level. When I went to buy this book, I was led in the bookshop to the poetry section, because, of course, the book we're about to talk about is based on fragments of poetry from the Greek poet Stesichorus. Like all poetry, you can approach that academically, but it's very hard as you're reading it to be thinking about right and wrong answers. It's delivered with such a rich textual appeal to your consciousness that you're not really trying to decipher it beyond just how the words make you feel. Let's talk about the book that you've chosen to speak about. I've given it enough introduction, and you can give a better one, I'm sure.
Well, I mean, I think your introduction was kind of on the money, particularly in my personal experience, because the reason I picked the book, I think, was it was when I sort of found myself leaving that stuff behind, maybe the baggage behind of like trying to impress my father, trying to impress my friends. I actually did a master's at Oxford in creative writing, English lit, and then I knew, and this is one of the books on the course. So again, I was in this space where I was trying to impress people, doing what I'd done a lot of my life, unfortunately. And then I was introduced to, and this is where sort of women became the core thing that you read, because most good contemporary fiction does come from women. And I was reading this book, and I was kind of like, and other books like it. I remember Maggie Nelson, it's not fiction, but Maggie Nelson's Bluets and Argonauts, and Marilyn Robinson, and Bernardine Evaristo, and all these amazing novelists. And it just kind of transformed the way I saw fiction, because the enjoyment almost existed beyond my ideals to impress people. And this book in particular, I'd never heard of Anne Carson. She wasn't someone I should read. I mean, she has kind of become someone, maybe, like she's sort of touted to win the Nobel Prize at times and stuff like this, but she wasn't someone I'd heard of, and I couldn't impress anyone by having read her. And I just remember being alone with the book and just going, the possibilities of literature often get stretched by the books you love, like it got stretched with, Beckett and Joyce do all these things. Like I remember reading Kerouac, again, that took me into a different place. Poetry does the same. This book took me somewhere completely different, and it felt very natural and organic. So yeah, it's kind of like you said, it's poetry in verse, or novel in verse, I'd say. Sorry, it's kind of an epic poem, but I read it like a novel. I think it's marketed as a novel in theory. Anne Carson's really ambiguous about it. She's sort of like, I don't really care about what genre it is. She says she makes things, and that's the way she likes to say it. And if you've ever seen any of her other books, I mean, there's a book called Knox. It's a beautiful book about her brother's struggles with addiction, but it's all in fans. Like things, so you can pull it out as one long text. There's others, I think it's called Float, which is loads of chat books inside a I mean, when I went to the poetry library, sorry, I think I'm waffling a bit, but I went to the poetry library in the South Bank, and because I was kind of intrigued by her, and I didn't want to buy all these books, because one thing about them is they are made, which means they're actually quite expensive. So like Knox is like 40 quid, so I wasn't going to buy it. I was going to go to the poetry library, and I went to the fourth floor, and I was reading all these books, and I remember just having them all in front of me and being completely blown away by the just ingenuity of it. But you strip everything back, and the prose and the poetry was still just mind blowing. So yeah, that's why this one was the first one I read, and it is the one. I mean, Knox as well is a breathtaking book, but this stuck with me. To give it a little summary, I think it's about Geryon, based on the sort of myth, and in the myth, he is this fearsome red monster, and Anne Carson's reinterpreted him as a young, vulnerable man who's in love with Herakles, who is in the myth kills him, but in this book he's in love with him, and they have a love affair, and it basically lasts, over the years. They reemerge into people's lives, and it's sort of this love-hate thing, and it has a lot of that longing, and it's just quite beautiful on love and loss, I think.
It's a lovely introduction. Yes, the book, of which we have the same edition, is Autobiography of Red by Anne Carson. So you've given a little introduction to the plot there, but can you say anything more about it for us, how you came across it? I'd just like to say that you do get this sense here that Anne Carson is kind of one of one. She's so unique. I've never read anything like this before. And there are sentences in here, and I'd like to read some out, though I'm sure you've got examples of your own, that are just breathtakingly original. But I'll leave you to say more.
Yeah, I mean, again, similar to my experience, these shackles came off, and then suddenly there was an organic form of reading. And to read, I mean, the competitiveness, I mean, I'd like to blame it all on my dad, but I think I was driving it too. I was always competitive, and competitiveness, it feels like such a shame that, for the 15 first years of my reading life, I was kind of reading to impress, or to escape imposter syndrome, or to compete in some vague sense. It probably serves me quite well, in that good reading begets good reading, having those relationships between books and understanding where this comes from and the context and stuff is always good. But yeah, I mean, for me, it was just the way, sentence by sentence, page by page, word by word, it just felt so purposeful. And you did feel that she was having fun with it. And you did feel that she was one of a kind. And I mean, she has this lovely thing where she says, I just don't like boredom. And I think that's so interesting in the context of what we're talking about, because, boredom's this thing that drives people to use their phones. It drives people to do these things. Boredom doesn't make you reinterpret the myth of Geryon and put it into an unknown form. Boredom doesn't make you create all these chapbooks. And that's why I think she is one of a kind, but also shown me the potentials of reading once I get out of my own head a little bit. So that was, massive part of why I find her so important. And there's quite a few books of hers I don't like. Her latest one, I think, was something Aunt Norma, and that's probably almost 100% wrong. But it was to me just not that memorable. But again, it was trying to do something interesting, and I think that's the thing with experimental. It allows a greater subjectivity of interpretation, at least. So, like, for example, I'm reading it and I'm going, this one isn't for me, but this one is so for me.
Yeah.
But I know people. My partner, she read this and she went, yeah. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, you take such offense to it.
But again, that's maybe your instinct, again, bred early on, of kind of there being a kind of an objective appreciation or understanding to attain. Your copy of Autobiography of Red is bristling with bookmarks. And I'd love to hear an example of a passage from this, which, by the way, is written in verse, but the way it's written will reveal itself to be very unusual and yet entirely intelligible as a narrative.
You have this, the way it's written, and yet when you read it, I felt I read it like a novel. I mean, there's a difference, when you read poetry, you do slow down. You tend to take word by word and see what they're doing. I don't know, maybe it was both, because I do see, even like in Jan, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but cutting off sentences, small sentences, long sentences, the way the poets do it, they occupy the white page essentially.
Yes.
She does that, but
Yes.
she never loses me the way a poet often loses me purposefully.
It's
So
true,
I
isn't
stop,
it?
I slow down, I speed
Yeah.
up. I felt this flow.
There are non sequiturs, you're right.
Yeah.
She manages so well to capture the fragmentary nature of consciousness, but in a way that is entirely legible to an outsider
Yeah.
looking into the inner life of Geryon in this case.
Mhm.
But it's a complex story. Again, it's based on Greek mythology, so it kind of needs a little bit of setting out before we just dive in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering whether it's, for me, it's not a clear narrative though.
Mm.
So it's kind of like, it's Geryon. He's young. He lives in a quite dysfunctional home. I suppose, putting the mythology to one side, he lives in quite a dysfunctional home. He finds a love of photography, and he's artistic and he's creative and he's vulnerable and he's in love. And the first bit I'll read is the moment he meets Herakles, who is, I'm trying not to mention the mythology, but he meets Herakles, who is someone he's utterly and completely in love with. And then I think the plot is just that love story in some vague way. And Geryon, I think it's pronounced Geryon. I actually looked
Yes,
at this.
Geryon. Yes, yeah, my mistake.
So it's looking at his inner life and the way he feels and his invulnerabilities and stuff like that. And then Herakles comes back into his life after leaving him, and then they travel with a third character called Ancash, who to a volcano for photograph and spend time together, I suppose.
It's a mysterious story told in a fairly opaque way, which is both opaque and completely completely transparent at the same time. It just kind of leaves you somewhat perplexed at just how Anne Carson pulls this off. Whether it was difficult for her to do this, it didn't. It doesn't
seems
seem
seamless.
so. Yeah, it seems effortless from her.
And I don't understand that. But I guess the writers I love, I mean, even someone like Emma McBride with Girl is a Half-One Thing, a book that I just adore, should never work. It's an absurdity. The whole book's an absurdity. But when you finish it, you kind of go, that's what I wanted to read. And she seems to make it so seamless. And this was like the example of where a novelist, a creator, as it were.
Yes, it's not even easy to define her as one or the other, is it? It's certainly based on this work.
She's a classicist, I suppose, is the one definition you can afford. So, but she just makes it seem easy. You feel like she wrote really quickly, almost, and yet I almost instinctively know that would be impossible. But there is that. It's not rushed, but there's a fast pace to it. There's everything to it, and you sort of rush. You don't rush for the story, but you are in the story. I mean, I read this pretty much in a day every time I read it.
All right, let's have
We'll give you a reading. This is where Geryon meets Herakles. He met Herakles, and the kingdoms of his life all shifted down a few notches. They were two superior eels at the bottom of the tank, and they recognized each other like italics. Geryon was going into the bus depot one Friday night about 3 a.m. to get changed to call home. Herakles stepped off the bus from New Mexico, and Geryon came fast around the corner of the platform, and there it was. One of those moments that is the opposite of blindness. The world poured back and forth between their eyes once or twice. Other people wishing to disembark the bus from New Mexico were jamming up behind Herakles, who had stopped on the bottom step, with his suitcase in one hand, trying to tuck in his shirt with the other. "Do you have change for $1?" Geryon heard Geryon say. "No." Herakles stared straight at Geryon. "But I'll give you a quarter for free." "Why would you do that?" "Because I believe in being gracious."
Then he met Herakles, and the kingdoms of his life all shifted down a few notches. You just sort of think, wow. Got another example here. It's from a different section. The chapters are also very short. That was from a chapter called Change. Oh yeah, I see it here. Geryon was amazed at himself. He saw Herakles just about every day now. The instant of nature forming between them drained every drop from the walls of his life, leaving behind just ghosts, rustling like an old map. Can you remember how you felt after you'd finished Autobiography of Red the first time? Because you've read this, I think, how many times now would you say?
I've read it 5, 6. I mean, I sometimes, like, if this summer, like during the heat wave, I have a hammock now, like as a wedding gift. And so I like
It's a nice wedding gift.
yeah, my brother just got me a hammock, and I was like, I'm gonna go sit in the hammock. And we got this small garden. I'm just tucked in the hammock, and I just read it because I was like, I didn't have anything else to read. And sometimes I don't know if you ever do this, but if I've got a trip coming up, for example, I was going away the next day. So I had reading for the trip, but I want to start as soon as I start the trip.
Yeah.
Like I want to start the book then. So I was like, well, I've got a day. I don't do anything else but read. And I'm going to sit and listen to music or do a crossword. So I need a book that I can read in a day, because I've got some spare time. So this is what I read. And I've sort of done that several times. There's other books in that category, like Bluets by Maggie Nelson is a book in a day. There's a book called Letters for D, which is a philosophy book. It's a book by a philosopher about his wife, which is gorgeous. But this falls under that category. And I think when I first read it, I did that thing that I don't know if other people do this, but I think it's kind of common, where you read something and you sort of put the book down several times during the experience, as it were, and sort of go, like I remember the first time it happened, it was Dylan Thomas poetry when I was like 15, again, reading largely to impress my dad. But it was the first stanza, second half, which is, though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion, death shall have no dominion. Then it happened with Kerouac. It was the mad ones, the ones for me, and the mad ones, the ones who are mad to talk, desirous of everything at the same time, the burn, 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 like fabulous yellow Roman candles exploding like spiders across the stars. Then it was Nietzsche, because I was at uni and I was that sort of person. And I remember this being like the latest one. And I had Middlemarch, I had it with Dorothea. I remember that when she talked about the greater good of the world by small acts and stuff like that. But this one, where I read it, it was quite different to all the others. It doesn't sort of follow any sort of, it's not as pronounced as known, but I just put the book down because at several stages, because I was quite blown away by it. And I think it's weird, because not to say I chase that feeling, but I think I do, in the sense of that feels to me like the authentic, like when you're reading and there's no one else. I remember the Kerouac one. Again, I'm not a fan of Kerouac now, but that it's about the age you were and how you felt at that time. And I remember being on a train and just by myself and being like, quite I had to put the book down. I was blown away by it, and that's how I felt here. And it's a lovely feeling, because it's I don't know, it's not the sublime, but it's something close to that. And reading can do that to you. And I'm not trying to impress anyone when I'm feeling like that. I'm not talking about it to anyone. I'm just in the moment and being struck by a book. If you want to talk about reasons to read, I don't think we'd say that much. The sublime, like, why should you read? Well, the sublime, but you should read because it can give you that.
Yeah.
And it certainly gave me that, and this book gave me that.
Maybe the word sublime doesn't necessarily capture it, especially for somebody who hasn't experienced that before. But can we talk a little bit about that feeling? What is that feeling when you put that book down, whether it's halfway through, a quarter of the way through, but certainly at the end when a book's blown you away? Actually, there's a feeling of mourning, of grief, of letting go. And you remember who you were, in a sense, when you began, and when your expectations were very low and you were even skeptical, sometimes even hostile. And then by the end, you feel like you've made a friend that you didn't actually want to make at the beginning. And now you're sort of a bit in love with them. But at the same time, they're gone now.
It's apt as well, because, I mean, the place you are when you read these books, I remember them. So I remember being in my childhood bedroom in a bunk bed. And when I read Dylan Thomas, I remember Ema McBride, I mentioned earlier, Girl is Half One Thing. I was on Copacabana Beach at a very low point in my life, weirdly. I decided to travel because I was having a bit of a sort of tough time mentally. And I decided to travel to South America wildly to see my brother. He was living in Colombia at the time. And I just went off to Brazil because while in Colombia, I might as well pop to Brazil. And I remember being on Copacabana Beach reading that book. Probably not the book I should have read. It's a devastating book. But I remember like throwing the book on Copacabana Beach while sipping a cocktail. Like it was an absurd situation. Like
Throwing it?
I threw it because I was so hit by it. I was crying my eyes out. And
was this when you came to the end?
No, it was just a part when I kind of couldn't keep reading, because it's as I said, there's not much hope in that book, and well, there's so much to love about it. But it was actually recommended, but at the time she wasn't my partner, but my partner who recommended it as like a book that blew her away. And I was like, I need a book to blow me away. And I was like, this is not the book I should read. But I go back to it because it is that devastating.
You picked it back up.
Yeah, but Kerouac, I was on the train.
Yeah.
Like Nietzsche, I was by the pool in Valencia. Maybe we read more on holidays, but I remember being in my Oxford bedroom when I read Anna Karenina. There was a part with Levin when I think he just his philosophical takes in that book are just so back and forward. And there's this passage about him finding love where he sort of has this nihilism throughout. He's an amazing character. He's akin to Dorothea. Those two are like sort of the great characters of my life, I suppose. But Levin is super nihilistic, and then suddenly finds love, and he's like, love is nothing, the world is beautiful, and he has this switch to optimism, and this sort of almost just like immediately love transforms everything in this almost flippant way, but it was just beautifully written. I remember that. So I suppose the grounding of it is interesting, how we know where we are why do we remember that
Yes.
specific thing? Like we do with tragedy. We remember the same thing with tragedy and grief when we find out someone's passed, or, you know, when you get bad news, or even with sort of more global catastrophes, we remember where we were when these things happened. So that interests me, but I think it probably is slightly to do with grieving and slightly to do with, but also I suppose the sublime is wrong, but it's about as close as I can get, is that, you know, you sort of, your life changes in that moment a little bit, and you're never the same person before. And I think, like, that sounds hyperbolic, but I fundamentally believe it. And just because you say your life changed doesn't mean, you know, you're an entirely different person. It just means that it did something to you that makes you think in the world in a different way.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, to do the Kerouac one, the mad ones, the ones who were mad to talk. I was a 18, 19-year-old boy. I don't know exactly, but I was trying to find some meaning within myself, and like, to be a mad one felt important to me then, and I should grip the world or whatever. It didn't transpire that I did any of that, but it suddenly gave me that boost, I suppose. And with Dorothea, I mean, it was interesting with Middlemarch because there was like a political element to that. Like, the greater good is, you know, being fed up of big characters. I mean, War and Peace does a great thing on you know, the strongman history sort of thing. But I thought Dorothea was so important because she was this person who persevered, and the greater good of the world is based on small things was just such a meaningful thing, and it sort of defined politically what I felt, and maybe gave voice to something that I didn't know, and maybe that's part of it too. That we have these feelings, these philosophies, and yet we don't really know how to voice them, and we see them in a book and we identify entirely with it. And you know, Dorothea is a bit mad. I haven't read that for. She's not a bit mad. Sorry, I mean, my identification with her is a bit mad. But at the same time, it meant something to me for whatever reason. I haven't read that book in a long time, sorry, but it's one that I want to return to. It's quite a task, but one to return to see what it is that she meant to me. You know, and I couldn't put my finger on it because I'm so. You know, objectively very different from her. But yeah, so maybe it's defining something we thought we believed, or transforming the way we believed. So we're becoming new in some vague sense, I guess.
I don't think it's any coincidence that we're having this conversation, and that, you know, this series has launched at a time when I think people have started to have their fill of nonfiction generally. People are finding their source of nonfiction in other formats, but it has brought the novel and fiction back to the forefront of cultural debate about why we read and what we get out of reading. And what you say there about Middlemarch, I think in the midst of all of that, this being the year of reading as well, there's talk of Middlemarch as being newly appreciated, possibly best work of classical English literature that there ever was. The novels that have meant the most to you have actually led to physical reactions. As you say, you know, you didn't throw Nietzsche in the pool, but you
should have.
Yeah, on reflection maybe, but you only really appreciate how books do this to you, how words can have this effect on you when you have exposed yourself to it, even just a little bit. I'm not saying that when reading Autobiography of Red, I had anything like that reaction, although I did have to put it down at times to just sort of take in what Carson had managed to achieve with a few words. I want to draw our attention now to other examples in the book where she does this. Are there other examples, other passages that you wanted to read for us?
I thought it would be nice to read so that was the introduction where they meet, and this is a moment later when they sleep together essentially, and again the language is beautiful. But what I liked about it is this is 2 years on, or many years on, sorry, and they are the love is sort of lingering, but it's dying to some degree, and it's and they're sort of grappling with that loss. Geryon is grappling more than Herakles, but you know, we only see Geryon's perspective, but from what you can see, he's grappling more. So I'll just go with it.
Go for it.
When they made love, Geryon liked to touch in slow succession each of the bones on Herakles' back, as it arched away from him into who knows what dark dream of its own, running both hands all the way down from the base of the neck to the end of the spine, which he can cause to shiver like the root in the rain. Herakles makes a low sound and moves his head on the pillow, slowly opens his eyes. He starts. Geryon, what's wrong? Jesus, I hate it when you cry. What is it? Geryon thinks hard. I once loved you. Now I don't know you at all. He does not say this. I was thinking about time, he gropes. You know how apart people are in time together and apart at the same time. Stops. Herakles wipes tears from Geryon's eyes with one hand. Can't you ever just fuck and not think? I thought, yeah. So for me, it was just, it's this him hanging on now to a love that we saw, and we sort of loved their love. It was nice, and it was appealing, and you're seeing him move away from that. So, and again, for me, it was also just the language here, like the half rhymes and the alliteration,
Yeah.
like the root in the rain and the end of the spine, the base in the neck. It's this, there's a rhythm that's so purposeful, and yet, unless you're really reading it closely, you wouldn't capture it. I didn't capture it on the first time. I mean, I don't think people can see that, but they're not going to be able to see it, but there's all these notes in different colors. And the one that I was on green this time.
Yes.
And when I was marking it, I was doing I was picking that up in a way that I didn't last time. Last time I had blue, and I'm just picking lines that I loved, So I guess the text that I adore, and this is probably one of my favorite novels, along with probably Middlemarch and Malloy by Beckett. But it was something about this, the rhythm of it this time, and what a joy that is to revisit books and find something new and uncover something new every time. I don't think I always have that. Often I reread books and I go, what was I thinking? But this one has never, maybe I didn't enjoy it quite as much on the 6th read or 7th read, but I still found so much that I appreciated.
Here's one from a chapter titled Somnambula. Hot pressure morning, house full of tumbling humans and their languages. Where am I? Voices from somewhere. He made his way thickly downstairs and through the house to the back porch, huge and shadowy as a stage facing onto brilliant day. Geryon squinted. Grass swam towards him and away. Joyous small companies of insects with double-decker wings. And fighter planes were diving about in the hot white wind. The light unbalanced him. He sat down quickly on the top step, saw Herakles stretched on the grass and making sleepy talk. It's just a joy to read. I don't know how else to describe it, but it's the joy that I get from reading poetry. And again, I wasn't reading this out loud when I was reading it before now, but reading it out loud, some novels are best read out loud, aren't they?
Some words that you have there thickly shouldn't work. It's an absolutely incorrect choice of words, but it works. And I found that so, like, how you can get something that shouldn't work that does is always just a joy. I mean, even swam there, that was a metaphor, but it was done very well.
Thickly downstairs. It forces you to understand how they felt.
A silly and potentially pretentious. Mentioning jazz is always pretentious, but I think there's no such thing as a wrong note. The idea that actually, if you do something, it could be, it's about choice, isn't it?
Yes.
You do the wrong thing and it appears right. And part of me felt that that's what she does. There's several times in the book that I'm like, that word is rogue. You should not be using it. But at the same time, you've done it and it's worked. And I'm not entirely sure why it has, because it shouldn't, according to some vague rules we have by years of reading, but it does.
Interesting that you invoke jazz, actually, because it's much more common, isn't it, for American writers of fiction to use rogue words in that kind of improvisational way. Kerouac has come up many times in this conversation already, and who very much took from the form of jazz, the impetus to write.
But it's interesting because I said I go back to books and sometimes I find more. Kerouac's the example par excellence of going back and finding less. I went back after years and people still hang on to him and I think love him. But when I went back, I was like, this doesn't work now. This style, spontaneous prose, or what I think they called it, but it just didn't land in the same way as it did to a 17, 18-year-old, where I'm like, oh, this is how it should sound. And I don't mind that, to fall out of love with a book is absolutely fine. I didn't really mourn Kerouac, in the way that we might say we mourn other books. But interestingly, it's the choice of words where Kerouac, for example, is making separate choices where he's sort of pushing us in this way, and the choices are blunt and they're brazen, but they don't land with me anymore. And so it's all subjective what rhythms work, but Kerouac's doesn't. So returning to that is always fascinating.
Not only does Carson's poetic language remind us in parts of Kerouac and of other beat poets, but when and if young men in particular come to literary fiction, Kerouac, along with Salinger, along with any number of, we can even say Hemingway, are kind of the go-to, the sort of initiating writers. Would you say, though, that there are other writers that really don't get a fair shake? Ones that if you were, say, in front of a young man curious about getting into fiction, not sure where to begin, you would say, you know what, you could start here. I started here, but try this first.
I was a Hemingway person. All of those things, every writer you just mentioned,
Yes.
I read everything because that's how I got into it. And I also thought, without coming from I came from a literary, my parents being literary working class, but I didn't have, like friends who were into reading, so they couldn't guide me in which way to go. So I read the books that I felt men should read, which was Hemingway. It was Salinger to a degree, particularly Catcher in the Rye. Even though Frankie and Zoe and all those books are like superior in my opinion. One that I found kind of, again, removing the shackles was Joe Dunthorne, and it was Submarine, and I can't remember the name. It's Wild Abandon. But I loved every one of his books, and it was a very organic, again, like reading for no other reason than I really loved the books. But for me, to be honest, it was mainly women that sort of did take me out of that, because I'm thinking of like Ben Lerner, who I adore, but I don't think he's a gateway novelist, in the sense of like, if you give someone his latest transcription, oh, you'll love this, get into fiction, they're not going to, it's not going to help you ease in. But I found with Zadie Smith, for example, with White Teeth, because I was from West London and the White Teeth was so Northwest London, I knew those characters, I grew up with them. And when I read that for the first time, I give that to my friends who are laddish and they're not into literature, but I give that to them because that helps them in. But it is kind of maybe a little geographically specific. But I certainly found that a gateway book. I found, like, I would probably, I mean, I do this, I suggest it to my lad friends because they don't read and they're kind of like, what would I read? Ferrante's another one I suggest, even though she's quite difficult. I do think she's super accessible. There is some of it might be a bit tropey, but there's violence and sex and stuff in there, which I think makes it more entertaining, and it's still very, very, very good literature.
You've got friends you've referred to as your lad friends, and you say they don't read. They don't read much at all, or they just don't read fiction?
I mean, of the massive group, let's say a massive group of lad friends, because lads tend to hang out with other lads, and there's just loads of us, could be 40 of us in a pub. I would say, tops 5, and they're not readers in the way I was. Like, it was like when I was young, I went on a lad's holiday and I brought, sounds very silly, but I brought Albert Camus' The Outsider because I was into philosophy. And my friends were laughing and finding this very funny. It's another holiday with another group of sort of lad friends. I brought Gogol's Dead Souls. And again, this was a laughing point. I never really cared. I kind of played into it. It was fine. But it was laughable. And 2 of my lad friends, actually, I say lad friends, it's a very simplistic way of saying it, but whatever. They wanted to read more, so they kind of said, why don't we do a little book club? So we have this book club. It's been going for sort of 5 years. We pick one book a year, but again, speaks to the level that they read. But they are the biggest readers of my group, and we're talking 4 or 5 books of fiction a year. They might read some nonfiction because, again, it is more appealing. A lot of my friends might touch on nonfiction. Most wouldn't read at all, I would say. But in this book club, I try and pick these books, and if they're around my house, they look at my books and go, what should I read if I'm reading? That's kind of a common question that I have with people who don't read. Like, what would I read if I wanted to get into it? And to be honest, a lot of them don't end up reading the book or read it slowly, and which is fine. And but the incentives were never there, as I said, growing up. And I think one of the reasons is that I don't think men intelligence in the way that you understand it in literary intelligence, but I'm not sure how valued that is in society anymore. There's things that are far more valued, the essentially ruthlessness. And I mean, one of the things we say, and I think this is a little bit of a mistake, is that everyone goes, well, men should read because it boosts empathy. And I think, well, that's what you want. But I don't think many men are sitting there thinking, do you know what I really need to do? I need to boost my empathy. I just don't think it registers. I think sometimes, even to put a really crude point on it, I think a lot of men might see empathy as weakness. I mean, it's the most powerful men in the world say that all the time. They reference suicidal empathy and all these things, and ruthlessness and cunning, and all these things are sort of seen as the things that are going to get you ahead in life. And so reading a book and developing your empathy might not be the best idea. And even stuff like the other thing they say, communication, that's a thing that literary fiction can definitely improve. I'm pretty sure those people go to Rogan, like,
Yeah.
and so I think when you frame it, it needs to be framed in a way it is betterment, but I wonder whether the outcomes, we know that outcome focused. That's why nonfiction is so prevalent. The outcomes of fiction, I think, have been demoted in society to a point that it's actually quite worrying. But the thing they're missing is your intelligence, and all these things give you, new perspectives on the world, understandings of the world, and all
Yeah.
these things. And maybe that's what we need to drum home a little bit more.
You began your journey as a reader from a young age with this sense that it was about self-betterment.
Yeah.
And you learnt too that what maybe was missing in that attempt to better yourself through reading was just the sense of the pure enjoyment and the pure subjective
Mhm.
appreciation of the words and the experience of reading it in real time. But it's true that talking about it as simply boosting empathy is perhaps somewhat misleading or just limiting. At its core, I think reading fiction is about suspension of disbelief and the power that suspension of disbelief creates, both neurologically and emotionally and intellectually, all together. You mentioned the book club that you started. What a great social triumph, and absolutely in the spirit of what this channel is trying to achieve, in a sense. Again, it reminds me of Dorothea. There was your small act, and it has brought friends of yours who previously didn't read fiction along with you.
One of them during COVID was just kind of texting me constantly about the books he was reading, and it sort of dissolved a little bit over
Mm.
time. But it's we still do the yearly books. So it's 3 books a year because you buy 3 books for yourself and then give 2 away. And we do 3 books a year. We haven't always read all 3, but it is a nice, like, and they found joy in it. They found like new worlds and the suspension of disbelief and all
Yeah.
these things. And so it shows that I think if you can get men into reading, men will read more, and that would be the triumph. But
Men, of course, have no problem talking about fiction when it comes to TV and film. An
Mhm.
important distinction to make. It isn't to say that men can't suspend their disbelief, but it's very different watching a film with friends and discussing it after. Very different when we're talking about immersing yourself in a text and knowing the whole time that everything that you're reading never happened. That is a big blocker, I think. To go back to the beginning, when we spoke earlier about where it all began for you, about your father's influence, and I noticed throughout this conversation you've had the red pen in hand. Have you sort of reflected on your relationship with your father? Have you spoken to him lately or in recent memory about what books have meant to both of you?
He actually passed away 2 months ago, which is why I'm actually struggling with the present versus past tense.
Mhm. I'm sorry to hear it.
Yeah, but I never really got the chance to. But there was a thing of growing up among that kind of competitive side and always trying to understand it. When I got older, I think I actually had resentment towards it. Like, why aren't you giving me that validation? And that's when the competitiveness came in, really. It's in overdrive because I was studying to. I'd essentially go to a library on a weekend, study George Orwell, so that I could come back to my mum and dad's house and undermine my dad. Like, that's weird. And I'm accepting fully that that's not a reasonable, responsible thing. But I think later in life, maybe it's to do with age, and he settled down a little bit. But also I understood that he had his own things going on in his life, which I think we often don't think about with our parents. Then we started talking about books in a more generous capacity. Maybe it was also partly because I'd done these things. I'd done some writing and stuff like that that had been moderately successful. So he took me more seriously. Could be any number of
Mm,
things. But when we would hang out, like later on in life, it would be a much more mutual conversation. Whereas
mm.
early in life, it was him talking and me sort of trying to get my words in, and not really having it. But in some ways, I'm so grateful because even though it wasn't ideal, and things are never ideal, I think if we actually like pinpoint our childhood, there's so much going on. The drives aren't always these clean cut drives. That's the issue with a lot of journalism, a lot of personal opinion and personal essays, is that you want a clean narrative, but it often doesn't lend itself to that. But you don't also have 15,000 words, and people don't want to go through your ups and downs of your childhood and how this led to that. They want that clean narrative. So there was a lot going on, but in the end, I think we met that nice mutual place of, he appreciated that I was a reader, and I appreciated that he gave me that. I mean, my mum, to be fair, she hasn't got much of a shout out, but she was also, I mean, she was a bigger reader than any of us.
Well, I was about to
Yeah.
say it ordinarily it's the case that if particularly a young boy grows up to be a keen male reader in any capacity whatsoever, it's the mum who has the biggest influence, the custodian of culture, as women often have been historically within the home. And I was wondering whether actually your mum was sort of behind the throne, as it were, of your dad's literary upbringing.
I think the thing about my mum is, again, she was a working class woman who wasn't in a literary place, but believed books would better you. But she was more interested in the less kind of, let's say, revered authors. She would read Jodi Picoult and
Mm,
like John Grisham and anything and everything. She'd go charity shops and buy whatever. She'd read 3-4 books a week. But I never wanted to impress her because I think my mum was impressed by me. So it's a kind of messed up thing that the person I wanted to impress was the one I couldn't get validation from. So I
yeah,
wanted to impress my dad
yeah,
because my mum was already giving me validation. Ioan, you're very smart. Ioan, you're doing a great job. Don't worry about it. I was like, no, I want his validation. So maybe it was that. Maybe it's the male father-son relationship, the competitiveness that can be kind of built into that. But
mm,
my mum was a huge reader, and we still talk about books constantly. We do things around books. We go visit places of writers, and so I have a much, let's say, healthier literary relationship with my mum because it is built on that mutual understanding that we're both big readers and we both
yes.
adore it. My mum put me onto Middlemarch, so she features heavily in this. It is a podcast about men, so perhaps my dad got a bit more airtime, but my mum put me onto Middlemarch and Jane Austen and the Brontes, and we explore that together, and that's gorgeous in itself.
Joanne, before we finish, I think it's just worth acknowledging, given how fresh your memory of your father is, particularly at this moment for you, that you did, after all, enter the profession that he esteemed highest of all, and I'm sure that makes you feel proud.
Yeah.
Really, that you became that in the end. Perhaps we'll have one last reading from Autobiography of Red. Again, you can get through it in the space of a day, even less. Poetry often, the word puts people off. I would really encourage people not to let that inhibit them with this.
Yeah, and I think a lot of poetry, the reason I find it quite difficult, it's so hit and miss. That's the problem. I don't know if I try and read quite a lot of poetry, but it is so. I tend to, because it's quite expensive. I tend to get them as Christmas gifts. Like I ask everyone, because it's not a cheap
Yeah.
hobby. That's why you go to the poetry library. But sorry, just to touch on it, is like there is so you can pick up a collection that everyone raves about and you can find absolutely very little in it, and that you pick up a collection at random and you find everything from it. So I find that a lot more difficult, whereas at least with fiction you typically get. But this one, if you're interested in poetry or fiction, I think it's ideal. I'll read. Ancash mumbles a word and slides back under his dream. Want to give you something to remember me by, whispers Geryon, closing the door. He has not flown for years, but why not be a black speck raking its way towards the crater of Ichanticus on icy possibles? Why not rotate the inhuman Andes at a personal angle and retreat when it spins? If it does not, and if not, wind bolts of wind like slaps of wood and bitter red drumming of wing, muscle on air, he flicks record. This is for Ancash. He calls to the earth diminishing below. This is our memory of beauty. He peers down at the earth heart of Ichanticus and dumping all its photons of her out of her ancient eye, and he smiles for the camera, the only secret people keep. I thought this is the heightened poetry element of it, and I thought that you can't almost not read that with poetry in mind, but when you read it in your head, it doesn't feel like that.
Mm. Ioan Marc Jones, thank you very much for joining me on The Lit Path. This has been the second episode of the series. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll be back very soon with the third.